technically.
That's right.
Let's see, Kate, you and Terry are in Colorado Springs, is that right?
We are. Our kids are in Denver.
Oh, I see. Well, that's good.
Yeah, so not too far.
Okay.
All my friends in Colorado Springs are texting me.
So far, we've got 40 people in the room so far. Oh, there's another 45. Here we go. Yep, they're all coming in. All right, well, I'd like to get started if that's all right. Let me just make a few announcements and then we'll turn this over to Kate. So good afternoon and welcome to everybody who is attending here today. My name is Karen Burkhardt. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. And we're so pleased to welcome you to today's program, Threats to National Security and what the intelligence community needs. We are offering this program today in cooperation with our sister council, the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, as part of their annual Global Security Forum that is happening September 29th through tomorrow, October 2nd. So I'd like to extend a special welcome to our guests who are here with us today from New England. I also want to point out that General Clapper's book, Facts and Fears, Hard Truths from a Life in Intelligence, is on sale with Amazon. We encourage you to buy this book, and I will be putting the link to the book in the chat function. I want to point out a few functions about submitting questions and comments. At the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a chat function for general comments that can be seen by all participants. There's also a Q&A function for submitting written questions, and a raise hand function if you would like to ask a verbal question directly. We will be deferring questions till after General Clapper's remarks, so please be patient if you have your hand up. Let me just take a moment to thank our supporters, the Tiemens Foundation, Wells Fargo Private Bank, Richard Petritz Foundation, Mackenzie Place, and also thank you to our institutional members, the El Pomar Foundation, Colorado College, the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, Pikes Peak Community College, Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC, SIVA Charter High School, and Fountain Valley School. Thank you to all of those. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kate Hall, our member, who will introduce our today's speaker.
Welcome everyone, and good afternoon. I have the privilege of introducing Lieutenant General James Clapper. He has had one of the most distinguished careers in the intelligence community. He's been a witness to history and a leader through many of the key events of the late 19th century to present day, including 9/11, the hunt for Osama bin Laden, the Benghazi attacks, the leaks of Edward Snowden, and the Russian interference in the 2016 election. The breadth and depth of his experiences in intelligence is unparalleled. He flew 73 combat missions in Laos and Cambodia. He was the J2, or the head of intelligence, at 3 of our military unified commands. And he was the leader of 2 large and very important agencies in intelligence, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. He was the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and from 2010 to 2017, he was Director of National Intelligence, which means he led about 13 agencies and departments throughout the US government. And on a personal note, in my 35 some years in intelligence, he was the most visionary and supportive leader I ever had the honor of working with. He is my friend and an American hero. Welcome, General Clapper.
Well, Kate, that's thank you very much for that overwhelming introduction. It's I was going to make mention of the fact that well, I hesitate to use the word old colleagues, but longstanding colleagues going back to our NGA days, and what a joy it was to work with Kate. And so this is a happy reunion for me, and I'm very pleased and honored to get together with the World Affairs Council of Colorado Springs. I very much appreciate the plug for the book, even though it's it's been out over 2 years. I thought I would recount one vignette in the book that hopefully be somewhat humorous and also illustrate a point. I grew up in the intelligence business. My dad was, I just lost my picture, so I hope you're all there. My dad was an Army intelligence officer, signal intelligence, got into it in World War II and then stuck with it afterwards. And so I grew up in the business kind of, and particularly after the war. And so the custom was in our family, whenever we moved, that my parents would drop me and my sister off at one of the grandparents. And they would go ahead to the next duty station, find a place to live, either government quarters or off post, get set up, and then retrieve us. So that's what happened in 1953. I was 12 years old, you can do the math. And we were moving from Hokkaido, Japan. Hokkaido is the northernmost island of Japan. My dad was number 2 in an Army signal intelligence unit, which was mission was to collect Soviet Far East military communications and convert them into intelligence. So we were moving from Hokkaido, Japan to Fort Devens, Massachusetts in the summer of 1953. My parents dropped me and my sister off at my grandparents in Philadelphia. Now the big, you know, I'm a grandparent now, so, you know, the first line in the grandparents' job description is, spoil the grandkids. And so that's what my grandparents did. And the big thing of the day, the big novelty was television. We didn't have television, English-speaking television in Japan. So, and my grandparents had this huge box in their living room with a little screen on it. And I was fascinated with television. And so my grandparents just allowed me to watch as much as I wanted because I was so thunderstruck with the novelty of it. So the first night I was there, I was still on Japan time, so I was wide awake, stayed up and watched the movie. And then I wondered to myself, well, I wonder what else is on. And in those days, of course, this is way before remote, you actually had to get up, walk over the television set and turn the selector dial to different channels. And there were only 4 channels to select from anyway. So I was turning the dial between channel 4 and 5, and I heard talking. No picture, just talking. So I just kind of got my attention. I just stood there and held the selector dial in place and figured out it was the dispatcher for the Philadelphia Police Department. Well, in those days in Philadelphia, and this was a Friday night, there was all kinds of mayhem going on, robberies and car chases and bar fights and I don't know what all. And it was just fascinating to me, just by listening to the dispatcher dispatch scout cars or cruisers to location of calls. And by the back and forth between the two, you kind of figured out what was going on. It just kind of interested me. So I stood there for about 10 or 15 minutes listening to this, got tired of holding a selector dial. So I went out to the kitchen, got some toothpicks, stuck them in the selector dial to hold it in place. So I guess I hacked my grandparents' TV set. So I stayed up all night, about 3 or 4 in the morning listening to this. Just for whatever reason, it fascinated me. So the next day, I scrounged a map of the city of Philadelphia for my grandfather. And then that Saturday night, did the same thing. And I started keeping records of the addresses of where the police cruisers were dispatched. And pretty soon I'm sleeping most of the day and staying up all night doing this. And I got 3x5 cards and figured out the 10 codes, 10-4, 10-6, 10-8. Each police officer and the grade of lieutenant above had his own unique call sign, figured out what the criteria, the threshold was for getting the police chief out of bed at night. And then by repetitively doing this and plotting how they dispatched police cruisers in response to calls, I was able to figure out what the police district boundaries were in the city. So about 3 weeks later, my parents come back to retrieve us, take us up to Fort Devens. So my dad, just to make conversation, says, "Oh, what have you been doing?" So I whip out my map and my 3x5 cards, and I gave my dad a discourse for about 20 minutes on the organization and operations of the Philadelphia Police Department. I don't know, it's 67 years ago, whatever it is. I still never forget the expression on my dad's face. And he looked at me, he said, "My God, I've raised my own replacement." So I like to tell a story because, you know, how I first knew I was going to be an intelligence officer. And also it illustrates somewhat about the nature of intelligence work, where you are trying to collect facts, which are never complete. You'll never have complete certainty. You can never completely eliminate uncertainty, but you build on your facts, you develop a hypothesis, you assess it and prove it. And that's how you come out with finished intelligence, but you're always dealing with incomplete information. So I like to tell this story, just, you know, hopefully somewhat amusing, but also illustrative. What I like to do is provide some wave-top observations on four current and I guess classical threats. That is Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran in that order, and then spend a little time on 2 or maybe 3 what I call transcendent threats. That is global threats not related necessarily to a nation state. And then I briefly cover some things that I think need to be done for the intelligence community, assuming Vice President Biden wins the election. If he doesn't, well, it doesn't matter, I guess. But I have been in touch with the Biden organization about my recommendations on things that need to be done to rescue intelligence. I'm going to kind of run through this quickly because I want to allow as much time as I can for what I think the best part of these kinds of sessions are, which is questions and answers. So let me start with Russia. I'd observe that, you know, my take is that Putin is actually a throwback to the Tsar era rather than the Soviet era. He sees great Russia as a great power. And although I think he is a realist about Russia's weaknesses, so he tries to compensate for those weaknesses in 2 principal ways. First, by maintaining a very formidable nuclear arsenal, which he's in the process of modernizing, to include mobile land-based missiles, and we don't have a counterpart to that. And so Russia is by far our greatest mortal enemy in terms of its capability to inflict death and destruction on this country. The other way he tries to compensate for his weaknesses, which is more direct, up close and personal for all of us, is what is generally under the rubric of what's called information operations. Of course, arch example of that is their interference in our election in 2016, and they are at it again for the election, this election in 2020. And Russia has, and the Soviet Union before it, long engaged in meddling in elections, theirs and other people's. And we have records going back to the 50s and 60s of their attempts to influence our elections, but never, ever on the scale, depth, and scope of what they did in 2016. And of course, the big difference is the use of social media, which they use to fairly well. As reported in the Mueller report, the Russians reached 132 million Americans on Facebook alone. And what they did is they wanted to sow doubt, discord, and discontent in this country by capitalizing on the polarization and divisiveness that is pervasive in this country. And they're doing it again now. And unfortunately, our president is in some cases, paralleling or echoing Russian narratives, particularly about voting by mail, etc. And so Putin's a zero-sum guy, and when he, in his mind, weakens us, which he certainly has done by sowing this doubt and discord, in his mind, he is strengthening himself and strengthening Russia. So in my view, the Russians represent the greatest foreign threat to our election next month. Now, to date, they haven't done any hacking as they did in 2016, at least that we know about. But they still have time, of course. And they certainly do have an aggressive campaign on social media. Now, what concerns me about this election, 2020, as opposed to 2016, is I know they are covering their tracks. They're being a lot more secretive and a lot more covert about it than they were in 2016. And you can bet the Russians went to school on volume 1 of the Mueller report, which never got the attention it deserved, which recounted the Russian interference in great technical detail. And you can bet they went to school on that and try to figure out, kind of back engineer how we learn things and try to, and I'm sure have taken corrective action. And of course, as we've seen, others are copying them, notably the Chinese, but they have much different agendas than do the Russians, and they're not comparable in terms of the threat to the existence of our very political system. Now, long term, the outlook for Russia is not very promising. Their public health, their demographics, their infrastructure are all trending badly. For example, between 1992 and 2009, the Russian population declined by almost 7 million people, or nearly 5%, a rate unheard of in Europe since World War II. And they have the lowest life expectancy for males of any industrialized country. And their mortality rate, their birth mortality rate is high and getting higher. They have all kinds of public health issues with drugs, alcohol, etc. So their GDP, just to put things in perspective, their GDP is about the size of Australia's. But Russia has a population of about 145 million, and Australia has a population of about 26 million. So you see the difference there. And their economy is single dimensional. It's based essentially on oil, which disproportionately affects their economy. They're subject to the vagaries of the price of oil. So the long-term prospects for Russia are not good, but short-term, they're a threat. And by the way, I guess I have to define short-term as now through at least 2036, that's how long Putin has engineered his tenure to stay around. And unless there be any doubt in your mind, Putin is bent on weakening, if not destroying, the United States. He has and this arises from a very strong personal animus towards us and everything that we stand for, or at least used to stand for. And he certainly endangers our national security. And of course, this makes President Trump's deference to Putin very disturbing, at least to me, as a lifelong intel guy. He's never dimed him out for anything publicly. The revelations about Trump's financial state really, I think, raises concerns of all intelligence people, or should, in terms of funding from foreign sources. And the issue here, this presents a huge counterintelligence vulnerability if you have that kind of debt. And for normal people, air quotes, this would really be seriously looked at by a clearance, an adjudicator deciding whether somebody should have a clearance or not. Let me move to China, which I regard as our greatest long-term threat. And I'll make an assertion here that what really impels Chinese behavior, whether foreign or domestic, is their internal domestic situation. That's what motivates what they do, even overseas. They are still very much in the mode of compensating or overcome what they call their 100 years of humiliation. And of course, they are consumed with maintaining control of their large population. In fact, they have underway now, using the pandemic as an excuse, an unprecedented and draconian surveillance and monitoring regime of the behavior and activities of their population. So they're really worried, hinky, about controlling that big population. They are getting stronger, much stronger, in two important dimensions. First, the economy. it's just a question of time before China overtakes the United States as the largest economy in the world. But it's true at the same time that China's rate of GDP growth has slowed since 2007 and continues to slow. Their influence overseas, they're using that economic power to buttress what they call their One Belt, One Road initiative, where they're spending something on the order of $1 trillion, which is normalized 7 times the Marshall Plan. And they are bound and determined to spread their influence and grow their leverage overseas. And what they do, of course, is force clients to owe them money. And the other dimension of this, they're gaining more and more control over international organizations, filling the void left by the United States. Here in the States, they have an extremely large, aggressive, and effective espionage program. That's their big thing, which of course continues to steal technology and intellectual property. FBI Director Wray recently stated that the FBI initiates a counterintelligence investigation against China about every 10 hours. That's a lot of investigations. On the military side, they also are embarked on a very aggressive and impressive military modernization program, which is designed explicitly to attack those aspects of our military that they feel are our strengths, our command and control, our basing structure, carrier aviation in the Pacific, et cetera. And so they build a lot of weapon systems designed specifically to neuter those capabilities. And as an example, they are now underway building their 3rd aircraft carrier. Now, having said all that, Chinese aren't 10 feet tall. For example, the country's shrinking working age population in relation to their growing older population, I'm a little sensitive about this, over time is going to slow growth when you have a greater and greater proportion of population that's regarded as not productive. So about 1/4 of the Chinese population will be 60 or older by 2030. And the PRC's top government think tank has said that pension obligation is China's biggest internal financial risk factor. And of course, I already mentioned this draconian control they're trying to exert over the population, which includes, literally millions of surveillance cameras. And under the excuse, the guise of pandemic, they've stepped that up. Nevertheless, that all said, I do think, we need to find areas where we can work with China and just recognize those areas where we can't. And 2 things that come to mind, of course, are climate change and pandemic diseases. And those ought to be areas, recognizing them as a common threat, that we can work together. Now, there's an argument among intellectuals about whether we're in a Cold War with the Chinese. One big difference between the Cold War that we had with the Soviet Union and the Cold War, if you want to call it that, we seem to have now with China, is that in the case of the Soviet Union, our 2 economies were mutually exclusive. Well, that's not the case at all with China. Our 2 economies are inextricably intertwined, and the Chinese could really hurt us if they started calling in our debt, much of which they own. Of course, our debt now is out of sight. But there's no question we need to resist China's predatory economic behavior. I think we could have been a lot more. I think the Trump administration got the right idea. I just think we could have been a lot more effective had we done it collectively and not try to do it alone. Say, for example, through some form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. A couple words on election interference. China, too, having watched the success of the Russians in 2016, they're up to it as well, but their agenda is much different. What they're trying to do is to burnish their image by distracting people from their response to the pandemic. Hong Kong, where they're quick to point out our hypocrisy, Taiwan, South China Sea, et cetera, rather than trying to directly subvert our political system. In fact, it's really not in China's interest to subvert the United States as a society and a political system. It's better that we exist for them. But they do want to steal intellectual property and they have invaded us economically. Let me turn briefly to China's troublesome neighbor, North Korea, a potential powder keg that, of course, could affect the entire region. I served in South Korea for 2 years, over 30 years ago, as the first of the three combatant commands that, as Kate mentioned, where I served as the chief of intelligence, or what's called the J2, in this case for U.S. Forces Korea. So I became something of an amateur student of the peninsula after that. And I was profoundly influenced by my visit to North Korea in 2014 and the opportunity to engage with a couple of senior 4-star level North Koreans, one of whom has since been executed. And I was blown away by the palpable paranoia and the siege mentality that exists in North Korea. You can feel it. It's just palpable in Pyongyang. So the bottom line from all this is the North Koreans are not going to denuclearize. They're simply not going to do it. And the reason is pretty simple, pretty basic. They view their nuclear capability as whatever it is, as their ticket to survival. And they're just not going to do it. They understand their weaknesses. They understand nobody paying attention to North Korea if it weren't for their nuclear arsenal or nuclear capability. And by the way, I don't think neither they nor we know if they'll work. The weapons will work. It doesn't matter because they have achieved what they want, which is deterrence. And deterrence is all about psychology when it comes down to it. Now, I will suggest to you something that's quite unconventional and heretical. But I've come to the conclusion that we might be better served to acknowledge de jure what we've already done de facto, and that is recognize North Korea as a nuclear state and insist that they behave responsibly. A lot of people don't like the fact that the nations like India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, but the fact is they have them, and the fact is they've been responsible with them. And so could it be perhaps with North Korea, if they felt more secure, they might behave like it. Now that's, I acknowledge, is all against conventional wisdom. I tried that on the last administration and it certainly fell on deaf ears there too. But I think we are smoking dope if you think they're going to denuclearize in return for a Trump golf resort on Wonsan Beach. That just ain't going to happen. I was a supporter and said so on CNN of President Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un. But I thought he kind of squandered the golden opportunity he had by his failure to ask the basic question of Kim Jong-un directly and get the answer from the horse's mouth. What would it take to motivate you to denuclearize? And right now, we really don't know that. So I don't know how we negotiate with them or how we have any sort of negotiation if you don't know what the other party wants. Now, we might not like the answer, but it seems to me we'd be better off if we knew what the North Koreans wanted. My interactions with senior Chinese officials, last time I was in China, I met with the Politburo secretary who is responsible for all intelligence and security in China. Kind of an interesting fellow, Secretary Meng. And my takeaway from that experience and others I talk with in China is they will put the screws in North Korea, but only so far. Because what is a strategic imperative for the Chinese is not to allow their buffer state, North Korea, to collapse. Because that is exactly the reason they intervened in the Korean War in 1951, is because they feared that their buffer state was going to be eliminated. So North Korea is also somewhat involved in so-called election interference, but it's much more like the Chinese, much more about burnishing their image. and they certainly don't have the scale or the sophistication of an information operations campaign, say on the level of the Russians. Real quick comment about Iran. And the only thing I want to say there is I thought withdrawing from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, the nuclear deal so-called, which had its flaws, no question about it, but I think it was another big mistake. And I think the United States succeeded in accomplishing three bad things by doing this. We lost, rather than gained, leverage over the Iranians. And we played directly to the hardliner narrative in Iran. Dealing with the United States at the time, with the Obama administration, was very controversial in Iran. But nevertheless, the moderates in Iran were allowed to go ahead with that. What's happened, of course, just plays to the hardliner narrative. And we've succeeded in isolating ourselves from other signatories to the JCPOA, because it wasn't just between us and Iran, there were 5 other countries involved. So for the life, and I could never figure out how not having a JCPOA somehow makes Israel more secure. I don't get that. And of course, in the meantime, the Iranians have stepped up their enrichment of uranium, and they've already shortened the estimates I've read about, shortened the breakout time to actually obtain a nuclear weapon. And they do have the expertise to do that. Okay, so those are the 4 nation-state threats I wanted to briefly speak about: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Let me turn now to what I'll call transcendent threats. And then there are 3 of them I want to talk about, which is climate change, what I'll call truth decay, and our president. Climate change. I don't want to dwell on the facts and stats here. I think they're pretty well known, at least to me. I just read this morning about the ice sheet in Greenland degenerating at a faster rate than it has in 12,000 years. And of course, climate change is closely related to its cousin disease. So just suffice to say, the Earth is heating up, and at a faster and faster rate, and as a consequence, sea levels are rising. And if you just consider the fact that of the 60 or so major megalopolises, I can't ever say that fast, in the world, virtually most of them are on coastal areas. So you can imagine what the impact's going to be in the future. And of course, we're now in our annual rash of hurricanes and wildfires. And whereas we should be leading the world in climate change, and we're nowhere to be seen. It was sort of pitched out of the fight. And in my mind, this has got to change. Climate change obviously has huge national security implications. Let me give you one factoid you never hear too much about. More than 1/3 of the Earth's soil, which produces 95% of the world's food supply, is already degraded. And that degradation will accelerate over the next 20 years as the world's population increases. Soil degradation is already occurring at rates as much as 40% faster than new soil creation. There's a book out written by somebody I know, Dr. Chris Tucker, that asserts, it's called A Planet of 3 Million. And it asserts that the Earth's carrying capacity for humanity is only about 3 billion people, which is a milestone we passed many years ago. Interestingly, President Xi of China recently gave a little recognized speech about a week or so ago, in which he publicly pledged lower carbon levels in China, which is potentially quite significant if China steps up as the global leader in reducing carbon emissions. The second transcendent threat I want to mention, which is probably more spiritual than material, is what the Rand Corporation has cleverly and aptly called truth decay. And this is the growing disregard for facts, data, and objective analysis in political and civil discourse. And this truth decay encompasses 4 interrelated trends. First is disagreement about facts and their interpretation. And of course, now we're seeing that play out with the pandemic and whether we pay attention to the politics or the science. The blurring of the distinction between opinion and fact. and the mainstream media, of which I'm now a part-time part, CNN, New York Times is somewhat guilty of that. The volume and influence of opinions and personal experiences rendered as fact, and you know, witness social media. The distrust in formerly respected sources of information, like the nightly news. You know, we don't have the Solomon-like voice of Walter Cronkite anymore, that you know, whom everyone trusted and believed. We don't have that. And truth decay has been afflicting us for at least 20 years. And it didn't start with President Trump, although he certainly amplifies it. You know, and his taped interviews with Bob Woodward are really sickening proof for me of his distant relationship with the truth. And at risk of offending somebody, I do want to speak, speaking of the existential threats to the United States, but I think the president is, in my mind, I know I understand others don't feel that way, the absolutely worst president we've ever had, as Vice President Biden said in the so-called debate the other night. He kind of vandalizes our institutions, the rule of law, an independent judiciary, a free press, the three co-equal branches of government, science, the military, our alliances, and most recently, paying taxes. And I think the message there is, you know, anybody who pays taxes is kind of a sucker. And I will tell you, in all honesty, and I'm basically by nature an optimist, but I'm really concerned about our upcoming election, both its conduct and its outcome. And he said, essentially, if he isn't elected, then the election is illegitimate. And by the way, this is exactly, this parallels the same narrative of the Russians. So I don't see anything but bad scenarios playing out for this election, and I think we're facing a very dark time in our history. I hope that statement's wrong, but I fear it isn't. So let me conclude with what the intelligence community needs in the face of all this, because this is just one of many institutions that are under attack. First, I think the intelligence community needs professional, experienced, nonpartisan leadership. Someone who's actually competent and knows about intelligence. There needs to be an affirmation of truth to power, a fundamental tenet, as Kate will tell you, of intelligence. And there needs to be assurance about the protection of whistleblowers and restoration of bipartisan oversight by the two committees. One of the two committees, oversight committees, the Senate Intelligence Committee, has been nominally bipartisan. The House Intelligence Committee, in contrast, has not been. And as a result, it is completely dysfunctional as far as oversight is concerned. And there needs to be two target, I'll put that in quotes, emphasis that need a lot more attention and resources, and specifically public health, climate change, that whole combination of issues, and a great deal more emphasis on China. And the House Permanent Select Committee Intelligence, in a rare bipartisan output, it recently published a report on what it saw as deficiencies in the ability of the intelligence community to cope with China. So with that, I will stop and turn to your questions. I don't know, Kate, are you going to moderate?
I'm sorry, I was not muted. I was not unmuted. Okay, I will start with this. We have a few questions already. The first is from Bear McConnell. Greetings, sir. Can the role of the DNI remain apolitical?
I'm sorry, what was the question? In regards to Bear, it's great to be in touch with him. First
Yeah. Can the role of the DNI remain apolitical?
Oh, absolutely. It should be. I mean, I think we've seen the impact of, you know, having political partisans installed as acting, and now DNI with Ambassador Grinnell and now John Ratcliffe, who were there simply to serve Trump's, the president's needs. And there are indications, I don't know this, but certainly indications in the media that some intelligence is being suppressed. And you just, because of fear of offending the president, particularly on Russia. And I ran into that when we briefed then President-elect Trump in January of 16 about the Russian meddling in the election of 2016. Well, he pushed back from it because acknowledging that cast doubt on the legitimacy of his election. But it's absolutely a fundamental tenet of intelligence, truth to power, and the intelligence community needs to be apolitical.
Thank you. A question from Simi Calais. You stated that China protects North Korea because it needs a buffer zone. Who is this buffer against? The US, Japan, South Korea, or all of them?
All the above. Initially and historically, and post World War II and into 1950, it was a buffer against the South, buttressed by the United States. And so, and if you're sitting in Pyongyang looking out, you don't see anything but enemies. And so from a North Korean perspective, that's why they need the nuclear weapons. And for China, the thought of having troops from the Republic of Korea and the United States lined up along the Yalu River is unthinkable to them.
All right, thank you. Next question. From Chris Miller. With regard to the threat of climate change, what are your views on how the intelligence community should go about analyzing the relative costs and probabilities of mitigating or reversing temperature changes versus adaptation, which seems far more difficult and less dramatic to envision or manage?
I think the contribution of the intelligence community is to be a supplement or augmentation to what is widely available openly in the scientific community. I don't think the intelligence community should necessarily be in the lead for this, but there are implications when you start to have frictions between countries, say over water or energy or food, and what that portends for the potential of active conflict between and among nations who are short of food, short of energy, short of water, whatever it is, brought about by climate change. So the intelligence community needs to help the larger scientific community be as anticipatory as possible, and also warn of and inform policymakers when other nations or international organizations are not being fully forthright with information that bears on climate change.
Very good. I'm not sure if this is a question or just a comment from Bill Murray. Turkey, Aragon, and Armenia. I think maybe they're asking for a comment on these areas.
Well, of course, Turkey and Armenia have a long-standing animosity. There's no question about it, and this very complex situation geographically. We're talking about, these are two former Soviet republics, which during the Soviet era, were at peace because the big bear Russians insisted on it. And there was an agreement struck, and I think in the 90s, where there is a zone that was essentially ethnically Armenian, but was controlled by the Azerbaijanis. And that has gotten, there's always been friction there, and apparently they are in active combat where there are dozens of people being killed and thousands and hundreds being wounded over this. And I don't know, Turkey is basically favors the Azerbaijanis. I have no idea how this is going to resolve itself. We don't seem to be engaged in this at all right now.
Marilyn Feaster is asking, do you think that the whistleblower Edward Snowden is a hero or a traitor?
Well, I'd say FAQ. Before the pandemic, I did a lot of colleges and universities, and I'd get that question from young people. And I always respond this way. If what Edward Snowden had exposed were limited to so-called, air quotes, domestic surveillance, I could almost understand what he did. But he exposed so much else that had absolutely nothing to do with so-called domestic surveillance, where he seriously damaged our foreign intelligence capabilities. Let me give you one specific example of why I don't believe he's a hero. We had a program that we operated with the Afghan government. It's called Lawful Intercept, where we were permitted by the Afghan Minister of Interior to monitor cell phones in Afghanistan. And that is, of course, in Afghanistan was, and I think still is, the primary means of cross-country communication. They don't have landlines there. That source of information was the most important source of warning for IED attacks against our troops. The day after Glenn Greenwald, who was a journalist who was in league with Edward Snowden, published an article in The Guardian about that program, then President Karzai shut it down, thus depriving us of our most single important source of warning against attacks on our troops. And there were many other things that were exposed that compromised our foreign intelligence capabilities and our foreign intelligence partnerships. If you're a taxpayer, you are paying for the damage that Edward Snowden did to our foreign intelligence capabilities and will be for some time to come. So no, I don't think he's a hero.
Jeff Stachel would like General Clapper's opinion regarding packing the Supreme Court if Biden wins the upcoming election.
Well, yeah, this is a little out of my area. I mean, this is, I don't know. I instinctively, I'm not in favor of it, just because my whole life, there've been nine justices. And so, and then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the end then? The Democrats pack the court, so then the Republicans pack it some more, and pretty soon you got multiple platoons Supreme Court. So viscerally, I just have an aversion to it. But I can certainly understand why the progressive, particularly the progressive wing of the Democrat movement, is concerned about it, and they see that as a solution. And both Vice President Biden and Senator Harris have been evasive, I'll say, about responding to questions about that.
All right, on a written question, how sturdy, from Rusty Stevens, how sturdy is our U.S. intel purpose and capacity in facing the current and future global threats ahead of us? What needs to change in the U.S. government, military, et cetera, to enhance that purpose and capacity?
Well, the intelligence budget right now runs around $80 billion or so in totality between defense intelligence resources and the what's called the National Intelligence Program. That's larger than all but 3 or 4 of the cabinet departments, and is larger than many countries' GDP. So the intelligence community has plenty of resources. The issue is, how are they employed? One good thing I thought the Trump administration did was when they published the national strategy, and they called out Russia and China as peer competitors, which I thought was a good thing. When I was DNI, the largest single target claimant in terms of money and resources that we spent on anything was on terrorism. And it always was a frustration to me trying to change that, because that was done at the expense of other important targets. So the question, it's not more resources as much as how you allocate what the resources you have. I mean, the U.S. intelligence community is a huge enterprise. Tens of thousands of people involved in it, and lots of money. So I think it's a question of reallocating it per the House Intelligence Committee report on China, for example. We do need to devote more collection and analytic resources to China. We need to pay more attention to open source and there's a rich gold mine of information data on China in open source. So, but those are things that are manageable and that, you know, a DNI can lead to change.
Okay, next question. Carl Schneider is asking, General Clapper, thank you for your service. I was in the Pentagon back when you were circulating the Beltway, and I worked in information operations for the G3 of the Army. How might we educate our populace to become resilient to IO and not succumb to outside influence? Is this a government function or folks like us who, quote unquote, know better? Or is the horse out of the barn on that?
First, thanks for service. And it's a great question. You know, classically, when we think about election security, for example, we think of the cyber dimension, securing voter registration rolls, securing the mechanisms for compiling, tabulating, and reporting votes, and protecting that infrastructure against cyber attacks. That's important, and I'm convinced a lot of great work has probably been done to improve our situation now over what it was in 2016. Just remember, though, that the voter apparatus in this country is state and local. It is not run by the federal government. So but that's only one bin, I'll call it. The other big bin is what I would call cognitive security or intellectual security. How do we get people to think, to question what they see, read, and hear on the internet? You know, I've often fantasized about, gee, we need some kind of body that can be a universally recognized and respected fact checker that people could go to and ask for corroboration of what they are reading or seeing or hearing. So at all my spiels on college campuses, I always enjoined the students to try to develop their own sources of information that they consider valid, and to check things, to corroborate. There's been some interesting scientific work done on developing algorithms that will detect linguistic traces of fake news, fake items, fake postings, and particularly those that you know, are of foreign origin. And the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, they have a role, which it appears to me they're trying to play to regulate and police this up. But that, of course, that's a complex issue there because you run into First Amendment considerations. So I don't know. It is an excellent question, and I'm not sure I got a good answer for it. I can't hear you. Are you muted?
No, I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
Kate Hall is asking, have Intel capabilities been degraded due to partisanship?
Well, I think the answer to that has to be yes, to a certain extent. But at the same time, I have to point out when I get asked about what is the state of health of the intelligence community, that there are large parts of the intelligence community that are not affected by the political fall of the wall. So, for example, one of my old agencies, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is largely technical, as Kate knows, is really not affected too much by this, or the National Reconnaissance Office. Or if you're overseas someplace at an NSA, National Security Agency site, or if you're in an embassy in some capacity, you're just kind of putting your head down and doing your job. You're really not affected by the political fall of the wall that's in the Beltway. I haven't said that. Some parts of the intelligence community, important parts, are affected by it, and notably my old office, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, I think CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency is, and most critically, most seriously, the FBI. And the effort, the trick is, how do you protect, shield, insulate your agency, your component from that in the face of clearly partisan pressure to come up with certain answers and to suppress certain facts that don't comport with the president's worldview. That's very dangerous. I have to say that policymakers, to include policymaker number one, always have the option of accepting, rejecting, or refusing intelligence. They have that option. I would offer that doing that over the long haul for a number of issues is actually dangerous to the nation's safety and security. So God forbid we ever have some sort of nuclear confrontation or nuclear face-off with Russia. Well, one would hope that the president would accept the intelligence information that he's been given and that he would be truthful with the United States public about it.
Okay, your overall assessment is extremely pessimistic. I'm bothered by the expectation that the burden of addressing all of these issues falls solely on the United States. What should we be doing to get our allies to assist? They seem to be more interested in some of these concerns than we are.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the question. I do think the United States formerly wielded huge influence in the world simply because of our leadership, where we can induce other people to do things and to cooperate. I think, for example, weakening NATO is not a good thing. You know, we're not there in NATO as mercenaries, you know, protecting those countries. We're there because it's in our best interest, the U.S. best interest, to have that forward presence. And the same is true of our presence in Japan and South Korea. And that represents a tremendous strength by which we can use as leverage with other countries to induce them to cooperate, whether it's climate change or anything else. And right now, there's kind of a huge leadership void, which I think over time is going to be filled by others. And I cite the example of the President Xi's speech last week, where maybe the Chinese will assert leadership in the climate change. Well, okay. If we're okay with that, and you know, under America First, we're just going to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. I don't think that's good. So I take the point about you know, the costs of maintaining troop presence overseas and base structure overseas and all that. But well, I tell you, it gives us a lot of leverage and influence in other areas because of it. And there's this, you know, the strength of our economy, which you know, once we get past this pandemic, I think will over time restore itself. I mean, there's no other economy that has the strength, the basic fundamental strength, resilience, and strength and vitality that the U.S. economy does. And that represents a tremendous pillar of our strength.
Question from Wayne Artis. If Joe Biden becomes the next president, what immediate steps should he take to restore American leadership worldwide?
Well, I'll give you one small example, which I have recommended to the Biden campaign. And I've suggested that they have ready for his signature a letter or an executive order that he sign out the day of his inauguration or the day after to the intelligence community, reaffirming the importance of truth to power, affirming whistleblower protections, reaffirming the independence and autonomy of inspectors general, which perform a hugely important role, particularly in the intelligence community, to ensure that what the intelligence community does is legal, moral, and ethical. And that would be a great first step. And I'm just, you know, speaking what I know something about, which is the intelligence community. And I think by example, by extension, there are other areas where you need to reaffirm sort of traditional standards and values of this country.
Next question from David Kugler. Do you subscribe to Graham Allison's concept of Thucydides' trap with regard to China? If so, is climate change a sufficient area of commonality to avoid eventual war between us?
Yeah, Graham's a friend of mine. In fact, I kind of work for him, or used to. He's now kind of emeritus. He used to run the Belfer Center at Harvard. I do a couple appearances each semester at Harvard, now virtually. So the major thing about his book is, of course, the history he talks about doesn't address the nuclear aspect for obvious reasons. And so I think just as it was with the Soviet Union and now with Russia, there's a certain restraint that, at least to this point, is imposed on countries with nuclear weapons. So I think that's the big difference. And I do think that climate change represents a common threat, a mutual threat, which apparently even the Chinese leadership is recognizing. And this is an area where I think we could and should work together. If you can imagine the impact, if China and the United States agreed on a game plan for climate change and reversing it or stopping it, the huge impact, the influence that would have on the rest of the world. And if we agree on that, maybe we could reach an agreement on cyber norms, for example. And I think that's possible. I think a little harbinger of it was the agreement struck in September 2015 between President Xi and President Obama on moderating cyber intrusions. And for a while, the Chinese moderated their behavior. Now at this point, of course, they're back to their old tricks. So all to say there is the potential there. But I think the big difference with Graham's book and our current situation is the existence of nuclear weapons and their possession by both China and the United States.
The next question is from Linda Euretia Barhal. With China continuing to build bases, such as in Djibouti, is China focused on long-term worldwide power projection versus South China Sea domination?
Well, hello to UV, a former partner in crime of mine. That's great to hear from her. Well, that's also an excellent question. I think China is certainly feeling its oats and is trying to exert itself in certain areas of the world, notably Africa and now even Latin America. Now, whether they have in mind the extensive overseas military presence that we have, I don't think so. I think their military presence, particularly in Africa, parallels their Belt and Road initiative, and they just want to try to exert influence. Now, Belt and Road has all kinds of flaws. Most notably, it's really exploitative, because what the Chinese want is they want these countries to owe China, and invariably, if there are big infrastructure projects, China will bring its own labor. So the Belt and Road's not all it's cracked up to be by the Chinese, but I think they are clearly interested in dominance in the Indo-Pacific area, no question. But I don't think they harbor, trying to do the same thing in North America or in Europe.
Another question from Bear McConnell. How do you see the intel sharing relationship with our allies today, particularly amongst the Five Eyes?
Well, I was in Australia and spoke to their press club in June of 17. Not long. I'd been out with the government about 6 months, and I was invited to speak at the press club. And at the time, this is 6 months into the new administration, lots and lots of angst about the U.S. and particularly parochially the Australian relationship. And what I told the press club people was that underneath, prime ministers and presidents come and go, but underneath that are a series of long-standing, sustained pillars of our relationship, notably military, economic, diplomatic, and intelligence. And those pillars continue. And so with our Five Eyes alliance, I really don't see any degradation of that relationship. I have suggested, and the intelligence people in the crowd will recognize this as a heretical proposal, that in the case of our Five Eyes Alliance, which is our closest intelligence partners, that we do away with no foreign and simply grant dual citizenship privileges and obligations whenever we're in each other's intelligence footprint, as recognition of the intimacy of the relationship between and among the Five Eyes Alliance. And then other countries could step up to be what are now called second parties. So I think those relationships are pretty strong. I mean, the U.S., according to Rome here, and the intelligence capability that we represent and the intelligence that we share with these countries is a powerful component of our fundamental relationship.
Thank you. From Rusty Stevens, how sturdy is our U.S. intel purpose and capacity in facing the current and future global threats ahead of us? What needs to change in the U.S. government, military, et cetera, to enhance that purpose and capacity?
Well, again, it's, you know, we have huge military, which the Trump administration has poured additional billions of dollars into. I'm not sure, you know, money is the solution here. I would just observe that all those tanks and ships and planes really didn't do much in the face of a pandemic, which has killed a lot of people, and more so than about all our wars put together, save World War II. So all that defense, in the classical sense, didn't do much to thwart, and of course, it profoundly weakened our economy. So these are things that no enemies ever wrought on us with our military. So I think, you know, it's big enough. It's capable enough, and I'm speaking both of intelligence and defense. So I think it's a question of allocation. So, and a lot of more intangible spiritual things, like, for example, reaffirming our support of NATO and not withdrawing 12,000 troops out of Germany, which is a great win for Vladimir Putin. So there are things like this that we can do within the resources we have to convey a powerful message. Make it clear we're not going to withdraw from South Korea. Make it clear that we're going to stay or keep our presence in Japan. Buttress the relationship, the military relationship, which is increasing with Australia. So there's things we can do within the resources we have. This is a case where what the president says and does is a powerful message in and of itself.
The next question is, what is your opinion on what can be done if the current president loses the election and refuses to leave office? Who has control of the military?
Well, that's a great question. I honestly, that's what's worrisome about this. I just don't know how this will pan out. And General Milley, as a senior ranking active duty officer, has made very clear that we want to keep the military out of this. But I'll bet you, as sure as we're sitting here, that the chairman has had discussions with his service chiefs about just what are they going to do. But I don't know how this plays out. We've never had a situation like this. That conventionally, there's always been a graceful handoff. Even in 2000, there was, and probably Al Gore never got the credit that he deserved for kind of conceding, but it resulted in an orderly transition. I can't envision a situation where President Trump would gracefully hand off the baton to a president like Biden. I don't know how that'll get resolved. Obviously, he thinks that it would get resolved by the Supreme Court. That's why he's so anxious to get Judge Barrett confirmed, because he figures he'll have 63 advantage in the Supreme Court. So I don't know. That's why I worry about it.
Next question. Do you think the administration shared the full Mueller report with Putin?
Do I think they shared what?
The full Mueller report with Putin.
Oh. Well, obviously most of Mueller, and particularly volume 1, was public. So they didn't have to share it. And I was blown away, frankly, by the level of technical detail in volume 1. Now, the Mueller effort was, they were a lot more liberal about exposing sources and methods than certainly we were in 2016 when we published the intelligence community, the unclassified version of the intelligence community assessment. And I was really amazed when I read volume 1 of Mueller about the technical detail in there, but it substantiates what the Russians did. So I think that transparency is great. And so there wasn't really much more to share beyond that, because it's all out there. I guess there were some things redacted, but boy, and it was certainly enough for the Russians to go to school on to figure out how did they learn this, and then go make corrective action to prevent the revelation and detection by the United States. That's what worries me about what the Russians are doing now, because I'm sure they're covering their tracks better than they did in 2016.
Question from Pamela and Peter Gerfine. What is your view whether white supremacists constitute another existential threat to the U.S. and relates to the truth decay that you mentioned?
Well, I don't know about, is this an existential threat? I do think it is I think extremists on either side of the political spectrum, extreme left or right, are bad. It just seems to me, and I can't prove this empirically, it just seems to me that there's the white supremacist movement is much more prevalent, much more numerous than are the loose aggregation of what's called Antifa, which is much more of a concept, and there's no overarching organization or a network of organizations. It's just kind of an ideological umbrella. Certainly, I think Director Wray of the FBI has expressed great concern about a white supremacist movement in this country. And of course, the president, whether, I guess it was, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but he certainly encouraged and called attention to the white supremacist movement by his failure to denounce it, and calling out the Proud Boys. And of course, they are really proud at this point. They're ready to go into action. So this is, and you can envision some bad scenarios in the election, particularly if it isn't called the night of the election, which is not required. I think we're going to have, we need patience here to wait until the results are all the votes are counted. Now, I don't know what the president will do in a situation like that, and I don't know. So this is why this is a period for me of great uncertainty and unease.
Yes, I agree. All right, Chris Miller, another question. Could the IC ever play a truly impartial public fact-checking role in such a way it would help rein in deceptive political speech from those in national elected office on both sides of the political spectrum?
I don't think the intelligence community should be in that role exclusively, or certainly not in a leadership role. If you had such a, entity, fact-checking entity that somehow would have the credibility with everybody, clearly the intelligence community would have a role to play, but it should not be the only fact checker or the only participant. I think this would require many entities being represented other than intelligence, and certainly intelligence has a contribution to make.
Okay, next question. What can a Biden presidency do to protect the U.S. against cyber threats? What does the landscape look like for cooperation with our allies?
Well, I think, frankly, the biggest challenge in the cyber realm is certainly cooperating with allies is a good thing, but I think the biggest challenge, which is a tough one, is sharing between the government and the private sector. This is something we've worked at. It's imperfect by any stretch. And for one reason, both camps, both the government and private sector, have reasons for not sharing. In the case of commercial concerns, it's proprietary, where they don't want to expose a cyber vulnerability unless they absolutely have to. And of course, on the government side, it's sources and methods. Now, having said that, I think a lot of progress has been made, particularly with the stand-up of the cybersecurity organization and agency in the Department of Homeland Security, which needs to be the buffer, the interlocutor between the spy, I put that word in quotes, the spy organizations like NSA and the private sector. But to me, the biggest weakness we have is within our own country, and how do we shore up our own defenses? Because I believe that the commercial or private sector will be the DEW line. You know, we used to have the distant early warning radar line across northern Canada against a Russian bomber attack during the heyday of the Cold War. Well, we need, the commercial sector needs to act as our so-called DEW line here, because I think if we're going to have attacks, particularly by a nation state, they'll be the first line of information on this. So that, to me, that's a bigger problem than cooperating with allies. I think a lot of progress has been made there too, but then you have, you know, national interests that inhibit complete cooperation in the cyber realm. What we need, what the world needs, is to develop some cyber norms. You know, it took hundreds of years to develop the law of the sea. To me, that's the metaphor here with cyber. And we're not nearly that mature with cyber. And until such time as the main players here, China, Russia, United States, can agree to some cyber norms and can, you know, enforce them, we're going to be kind of in the Wild West era that we're in now.
We did have one raised hand function, but I think it may be down now. Hank, are you still wanting to ask a live question? There was a written question as well, so I'll go ahead and read that from the same person. Do you think that there is a possibility that COVID is a deliberate biological attack? And if not, is there a chance of this in the future?
I don't think COVID was an attack. I think all the evidence that I've been able to see indicates that it's actually naturally occurring. I didn't buy into this lab thing, or that the Chinese did this intentionally. Now, yeah, sure, it is a possibility, and there are certain nations, North Korea being one of them, that and China another, that have biological weapons research programs. And those are very difficult to detect because invariably they're dual use. They can be perfectly innocent and appear to be innocent, but they're very hard to detect. But it is certainly a possibility. I've often postulated, for example, an attack on our agriculture, a plague of our wheat and corn crops, whatever, which would be quite devastating. So it's certainly a possibility. But there is, again, it's like nuclear weapons, there is a deterrent factor, because if you employ a biological weapon, you risk great blowback.
Okay, the next question. With the benefit of time passing, what are your views on the FBI's handling of contentious issues of the 2016 election? The Clinton email, the Trump Russia, and the subsequent investigations?
Well, you know, I watched most of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing yesterday that Jim Comey appeared at virtually, and I really felt for him. I think there were some very difficult contentious decisions that all of us who were involved had to make then about what was the right thing to do. In my view, there was a predicate for investigating the campaign and interactions between the Russians and the campaign. As recounted in Mueller, there were some 142 interactions between members of the Trump camp and Russians. Well, why is that? What was going on there? And of course, you have the Trump Tower meeting in June of 16, which contemporaneously we didn't know anything about, thus proving that we weren't surveilling Trump Tower. And of course, you had the candidate Trump's exhortation in July of 16 to the Russians that, hey, Russia, go find those 30,000 missing emails. And there continues to be, of course, a question about the connection between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks via Roger Stone. So to me, there's enough evidence there that it should have been investigated. You know, the intelligence community was pilloried in the 9/11 Commission report for lack of imagination. Well, it's really not hard to imagine a connection between the Russians and the Trump campaign. And in my book, I recount the startling parallels and similarities in themes of things that the Russians were saying and things that the Trump campaign was saying, notably having to do with Hillary Clinton's health. So, looking back, yeah, I think it was the right thing to do, but any little mistake, as we're seeing now, will be blown up and politicized. And regrettably, in maybe one of the most important FISA applications, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act applications in the history of the program, and the FBI kind of blew it, made some mistakes there that others would capitalize on. You know, I don't mean to minimize it, but in the larger scheme of things, that was kind of a small thing. It wasn't small to Carter Page, certainly, but in the larger scheme of things, you know, not such a big deal, at least a big deal it's been made into. So it was a very difficult time. Anything you did was fraught with potential political compromise. You know, the Obama administration is often criticized because, well, we didn't do enough, fast enough against the Russians in 2016. Well, at the time, contemporaneously, there were good reasons why, at least in the mind, I think, of President Obama, why we didn't. We were concerned about if we spoke about this, or if he went on primetime television and talked about what the Russians were doing in the fall of 16, well, are you amping up what the Russians were doing? And more importantly, perhaps, President Obama didn't want to be seen as putting his hand on the scale in favor of one candidate to the disfavor of the other. So those things mitigated against more aggressive action, which he's, you know, or the prior administration is criticized for, ironically, by this one. So there was no rule book for this. It's unprecedented, and I was sure everybody involved at the time was trying to do the right thing for the country.
This is a related question to that issue. What do you think about Rosenstein telling the intelligence agencies to stop assessing Trump's involvement with Russia?
Well, I don't know that he did that. I don't know what the interaction is between Rosenstein and the Mueller investigation. The written charter that he gave to Mueller had a provision in it which actually was pretty broad. So I don't know that actually happened. I don't know about the interactions between Rosenstein and Mueller.
All right, another question. What possibilities and challenges do you see in the future for African nations?
Well, they have huge challenges in respect to, well, public health, just to start with that, with governance. They, you know, when certain countries have weak governance, porous borders, the ready availability of weapons. So there are many problems in Africa. There's also, of course, huge potential. And that's one reason why the Chinese are so aggressive in establishing beachheads, if you will, in Africa, because they see the potential here. And I just hope the United States doesn't pitch out because there, as I say, I think there's with the raw materials in Africa, there's a tremendous potential. I mean, for the people of Africa and the rest of the world.
Okay, I'm going to try and make sense of some of these comments. There are two comments from Bill Murray. I think he wants a comment on maritime dominance, Panama Canal, now Italian ports, and on. And then later on, would like you to comment on the Clipper chip.
Wow. It's one at a time here. The first one is on maritime dominance.
Yes, the Panama Canal, now Italian ports, and so on.
Italian ports. I don't know what to say about Italian ports.
Bill, if you're on and you'd like to clarify, please unmute yourself. Perhaps we can go ahead with the other question.
Well, the Panama Canal, of course, remains, obviously very strategic, although it is, I visited there once many years ago. It's really a fascinating operation, but it's got some limitations because lots of large tankers, large freighters can't go through it because they're too big. And so I think whether we actually own it or not, I think the U.S. is always going to have a paternal protective interest in the canal. Clipper chip, I'm not sure what the question is. I don't understand what I'd say about it.
I'm not either. So maybe we'll get some clarification, but in the meantime, I'll move on. What do you make of the investigating of investigators endorsed by the current Department of Justice that is still to yield reasonable results?
Well, I think, the efforts of the Department of Justice Inspector General, Horowitz, who is, has a great reputation as being a very thorough, tough, objective, but fair Inspector General. And I think that's where it should have ended. If you're going to, that is the appropriate thing to do. He came out with an exhaustive, well-documented report, and that should be it. But now we're investigating the investigators who investigated the investigators. So when does this end? So I don't, and the reason the Durham investigation, I guess, was stood up because the president didn't feel that what Horowitz said was sufficient. And he did say that what the actions the FBI took were without political bias, and I believe that's true. Sure, employees in the FBI had political views just like everybody else, but there was no documentation that those political views affected any official actions that were taken. Well, that's not the answer that some people wanted, and so now we have another investigation on top of that. So I think that's why the inspectors general are so important in our system, and their independence should be reaffirmed.
Okay, we now have Bill Murray. He's able to speak. So Bill, why don't you go ahead with your questions? You're unmuted. Not sure. Still can't speak. Okay, not sure why. Okay.
Well, just one comment on Clipper chip. I don't know if this is responsive or not, but the whole issue here is the extent to which the government can be trusted to provide, to me, this is the issue it raises, to provide cybersecurity for private entities. And of course, the obverse of this that is a real problem in this country is the security of encrypted apps or iPhones, which law enforcement can't read. So if you have a murderer with an iPhone that has potentially evidence on this, relevant evidence on a cell phone, an iPhone, you can't read it. Well, that's to me is a bad place for us to be. And unfortunately, that whole argument now has gotten very absolutist, where both sides have very absolutist views. Not knowing exactly what the question is, just a comment I'd make.
Well, our questions continue to come in quickly and furiously, and I see that our time is up and we're not going to be able to get to more, but I'll just ask one final question, and this is partly from Kate. You have many friends here in Colorado Springs, it appears. Can we hope to see you here someday?
Well, it's just like when I get subpoenaed to testify these days. And I'm happy to show up in person as soon as I'm vaccinated. I anticipate doing any flying travel until then. And given my age demographic and my wife, so we're pretty super hyper cautious. But I appreciate the invitation, and I'd love to come back. It's a wonderful place.
Thank you. We look forward to that day, and thank you to everybody for attending. Let me just announce our next two programs. Our next speaker series webinar is October 15th. It's entitled Planning for Tokyo 2020 Olympics and the Paralympic Games in 2021. This is a panel discussion to discuss the effects of rescheduling the Olympic Games this year. And then on October 20th, we will be hosting former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and NATO, Kurt Volker, Ambassador Kurt Volker, for his program entitled Building the Post-Election, Post-COVID World. So we look forward to seeing everybody there, and thank you so much for attending. For more information on our programs or to join our mailing list, please visit our website at csworldaffairs.org. Thank you, and thank you again, General Clapper. It's been an honor to have you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the great questions.
Have a great day, everybody.